Hello students, this is Professor McDonald. This will be another narrated PowerPoint slide presentation. Next slide. This will be for Chapter 4, Terrorist Violence and the Role of the Media. Just as a reminder, make sure that you review the film clips that I've included in the syllabus, and also you can find them under course content. In particular, for this chapter that complements this chapter are some film clips relative to Palestinian Hamas children TV shows. So make sure you review those as well as review the slides that we'll cover in this narration. Our chapter objectives: we're going to explain how terrorists can manipulate the media to further their cause, list the types of media available to terrorists and their groups, describe how the media reports terrorism events, and define the contagion effect and explain whether it has a viable influence on future terrorist behavior. Three primary areas will be mass communications and the terrorist message, mass communications in the new media, and reporting terrorism. I think it's important just to remember as we begin this chapter that information is power, and I think most of you can understand what that means. Information relative to the media is powerful not only in the hands of government but also in the hands of individuals. And when we're talking in most terrorist environments, we're talking about dissidents that are below state level. They truly recognize the power of the media. We see that every day in the various media types that we will discuss as we move forward. But it's important to remember that this is a very, very powerful tool that can be useful, obviously, to government, but also in the wrong hands. It can have a very detrimental effect on our ability to combat terrorism in the world. Exploring the role of the media. Mass communications and the terrorist message. Well, there are four primary methods, I'll say, of how terrorists get their message out. Obviously, one is the print media, and this historically has been a very strong element of getting their message out during the 20th century, in particular through newspapers, through underground newspapers, and even today. How often today do you not pick up a paper? In fact, it's very difficult to pick up a newspaper, any reputable newspaper, and not see an article somewhere about terrorism. Now, how that subject is approached in that newspaper, of course, is what's critical. And obviously, from a terrorist perspective, they want to be able to manipulate that media where it presents them in an image that's consistent with their values and their goals and objectives. There's a good example in the textbook when they talk about print media, and this was in the efforts to catch Ted Kaczynski, who was the infamous Unabomber, a domestic terrorist that carried on a long-term, over many years, bombing spree, very intermittent. He would place or mail bombs, maybe several in a row, and then he would be very quiet for a long time. Then he would emerge again. But he was getting ready to reemerge, and he actually wrote a letter to several major media outlets and said he would stop, he would not continue his bombing spree if the media would publish his manifesto. His particular ideology, he had a strong dislike for the use of technology and the advancement of society through technology. And if you have the time, just pull up the Unabomber manifesto and you can read some of his thoughts. But at the time, there had been a lengthy investigation involving the FBI and postal inspectors trying to catch this guy, and they decided to work with the media and publish this manifesto in hopes that somebody might recognize his writing, because normally we don't adhere or would never give terrorists an opportunity to put their propaganda out purposely. But in this case, the investigators, along with the prosecutors and the media and the government, decided that, hey, let's take a chance. Maybe somebody will recognize his writing. As it turned out, they did. It was actually his brother who turned him in, and eventually he was caught, prosecuted, and the investigation was closed, and his long-term ability to create fear for his domestic terrorism was over. So again, just to put another spin on it as well, the battle is always between a free press and the spin that can be placed on the media, whatever element it is. So we always have to think about that when we think about mass communications and the terrorist message. I mean, ask yourself, is it easier for terrorists to operate and get their message out in a free democratic society or an authoritarian society where the media is controlled, places like China? I mean, think about Hitler. Do you think he controlled the media and the messages that went out? Absolutely. In addition to the print media, we have radio. Radio, even though it's useful, it doesn't quite have the presence it once did earlier in the 20th century with terrorists. And the reason simply is with television, and everybody's got a television, everybody watches television, and in the prolific use of the internet, these have become the choices of mass communications for the terrorist message. And I've got some photographs I'll show you later and examples as well. So if we look at these four primary communication vehicles, I'll say print media, radio, television, and the internet. The photograph you see there is a photograph of Zawahiri, who is the current leader of Al-Qaeda since the demise of Osama bin Laden. There's also what they call the new media, and this uses existing formats and alternative broadcasting formats to analyze and disseminate information. And when we think about the new media, we think about tabloids, special interviews, talk shows, things of this nature that have emerged where terrorists could use the media through this particular, this new media to get their message out. When I think of Twitter and these new technologies, these are also opportunities for terrorists to utilize them, and they're very prolific and they're very proficient in the use of the media. If you watch the news today and you see some of the tapes, etc., that are being put out by groups like the Islamic State, these are professionally done. If you look at some of their recruiting tapes and other communication vehicles that that terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah put out, they're very professionally done. Reporting terrorism is an interesting thing because, again, I had mentioned earlier the free market aspect of it, but also and the ability within a free, open society to have more success. But there's different perspectives, and we have to remember that. If you know, the United States, they talk about in the book during the Iraq War and Afghanistan, we had embedded reporters with the military, and they would report on military operations at the time. And on the other hand, if you were in the Middle East, and I was over there many times and saw different spins that would come out on the local channels, Al Jazeera, which now actually has outlets here in the United States and a presence. They're based in Qatar, in the Middle East. And during those wars, while many of our reporters were reporting the military operations, they would show images of injured civilians and people that had been injured in the fighting. So a different perspective, appealing to a different audience, and perhaps providing another look at war itself. You always got to remember market competition. Hey, these news people, these companies, they're profit driven, and so there's competition amongst them as to scooping, who's going to get the scoop, who's going to get the exclusive, and of course when this occurs, there's times when the media actually could be taken advantage of in an effort to get a scoop. You could have terrorists use the media for their own propaganda uses and and pull one off on them. So that's something that the news has to be careful of. They do have a thing called news triage, and what's the report? And obviously, they're going to report in today's world of 24/7 news broadcast. They're going to report what they think their viewers want to see, and if it's violence, if it's a terrorist attack that occurs overseas, the more viewers they have, the more that they can sell advertising. So that's the reality of the media today. An important part of, and in the slide they talk about market competition. Labeling has an impact as well. I'm sure if you watch the news, some news programs call terrorists terrorists, some of them call them guerrillas. They talk about that in the text a little bit. I'm sure if you were looking at a Palestinian member of Hamas who detonates an explosion and kills some Israelis, the Palestinian newscast would show him as a freedom fighter, whereas the Israelis would label him as a terrorist. So don't forget that a lot of time labeling does occur. Terrorists like to dehumanize their targets, whether it be symbolic targets or their victims. They could call people crusaders or imperialists, this type of word that would appeal to their constituency, the people that they're trying to please. I mean, governments can also label. I mean, let me give you an example. This is something that caught a lot of press in the United States and still does. When Major Hassan murdered all those soldiers at Fort Hood, and before he murdered him and started shooting the place up, he yelled Allah Akbar, which is a common phrase mentioned by terrorist groups. And he, as it turned out later on, had been influenced, was very disillusioned with the United States government, its involvement in Muslim lands, and he had been influenced and been in contact with known terrorists. Well, our government labeled that event as workplace violence, whereas some people in the media thought that it should have been labeled as terrorism. So this is where the labeling, just an example where labeling can play a role, not only from the terrorist perspective, but also from the government perspective. And again, don't forget, in this slide, mass communications and the war for information. Mass communications can become a weapon. I mean, you have to look at it as a weapon in both conventional and asymmetrical conflicts. Terrorists use this as a weapon to help them in their war to win the hearts and minds, the propaganda battle. Another thing they talk about is media scooping. How can I time the events that I'm planning to do to make sure I get the maximum coverage? And they talk in the book about Carlos the Jackal, who was involved in an event where he was affiliated with terrorists, Palestinian terrorists that were involved in a 1975 OPEC hostage crisis. And when they were getting ready to escape, he purposely held up his escape until the TV cameras got there, so it would be dramatic and publicly videoed and transmitted to the world. I mean, one of the infamous terrorists from the Palestinian era, Palestinian territories, he always talked about how terrorism is theater, and everything must be on the media. That's how they bring attention to themselves. So it's very, very important, this use of the media, this ability to manipulate it, and the media does become a weapon. It can be a weapon for government as well and terrorists alike. Again, information is power. Terrorists also have to watch it because they can get a backlash from what they do. If you look at the Beslan event, and I think that's something, if you haven't seen that tape, I've got it assigned later on in the semester. But this event involved the killing of many young Russian children, and as it turned out, there was a lot of backlash. Actually, that's going to be assigned during week 6. There was a lot of backlash against the Chechen terrorists that were involved in this, because even some of their supporters were horrified by the fact that they went after and they killed women and children. Not so much the women, but the children. And so there can be a backlash, and that's the risk that you always take when you're involved in trying to get your propaganda message out through the media. And again, it doesn't always work to their advantage. And public opinion, again, that media-oriented terrorism, that's what it is. That's a good way to describe it. They describe it in the book, media-oriented terrorism. Another thing they talk about is the contagion effect relative to mass communications. And the contagion effect refers to the theoretical influence of media exposure on the future behavior of other like-minded extremists. In other words, kind of like a copycat murderer. If I'm a independent cell of self-made terrorists, and we're thinking about engaging in terrorist violence, and we see somebody else that would be similar to our organizational structure and similar to our capabilities on television being successful in carrying out a terrorist attack and getting that media exposure and the propaganda out to their constituency, well, maybe if they can do it, I can do it. And that could be that's when they talk about the contagion effect. They talk about it, again, it's a theory, but with the globalism of today's world, the use of the advent of communication technologies such as cellular phones, text messaging, the internet, the recruitment, the use of the internet for recruitment, the use of the internet and cell phones in operations. There's even documented operations where terrorists were carrying out an operation and during the course of that operation, their handlers were in other countries, maybe Pakistan, maybe Afghanistan, talking to them on the cell phone, telling them what to do next. So these new technologies are out there, and again, in theory, with these new technologies and the ability for this 24-hour coverage, it is possible that this contagion effect is a reliable theory where like-minded individuals can be stimulated. Hey, if they can do it, I can do it. So just something to think about. Can the press be manipulated? Absolutely. In this battle to get stories, sometimes they might cross the line, and where they think they're reporting on something independently and objectively, they might actually be pawns at the tool of the terrorists that are manipulating the media for their advantage. This is a good slide, and the table is in your book. I'm not going to read it, but many times terrorists, again, in that labeling, they are going to label themselves a certain way that makes them look, and they're very conscious of their public image and how the media represents them. So they're going to always cast themselves as liberators and soldiers in a struggle, in a war. If we look at the table here, let's go down to Party of God, Hezbollah. Their self-designation is they're a movement representing God's will. So when they engage in terrorist activity or operations against the Israelis, who's their primary adversary, they look at that as being God's will. We're carrying out a holy war, and we're carrying out God's will here on earth. And their champion group, it would be the faithful, the Muslims that would align with them. So this chart's good. It gives you many. I'm not going to read all of them, but it gives you some good examples of how that self-designation and purpose and champion group are all linked as terrorists move forward and try to use the media to their advantage. These are just some photographs that you'll see. The one at the top left is Islamic State showing their brutality. These pictures are being published all the time. They want to show, obviously, strike fear in the hearts of any that would oppose them as they line up their captives and shoot them in the back of the head. On the top right there, you see that's a screen print of a supposedly a young boy involved with who's under the patronage of the Islamic State and getting involved in executions. Lower left, you see groups of young people. I believe this is either Hamas or Hezbollah. Almost looks like watching a Boy Scout troop, but you can see where the media, the use of this media can also influence these young people to want to be part of it all. It seems exciting. And at the bottom right, you see a young girl and her statement, "I want to fire missiles at the Jews and be martyred like my father." So again, these are powerful media images that the terrorists know can be tremendous propaganda tools. Just quick, I've already talked about Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, just a picture of him, and a picture of the newspaper, which actually, the Washington Post, New York Times, I think the Chicago Tribune might have also published it, I'm not sure. And as it turned out, it was a good tactic. It did identify him. When he was captured, he was living in a small cabin up in, I believe it was Montana, out in the mountains, and he had multiple pipe bombs. That was his method of operation, pipe bombs that he had already put together, and he was working on some others. So they got him at a good time. Here's some other pictures. The freedom of the press conflict. The press should have the freedom to report what they want, but they have to watch, make sure they don't become manipulated themselves. The picture on the right is a famous interview with ABC did with Osama bin Laden. This is back before 9/11, and many thought that that was an opportunity for Osama bin Laden to get his message out, and using an American national news organization like ABC. On the left, there's pictures of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Again, media is a weapon. And let me ask you this: what do you think? Do you think journalism? Do you think they do a good job of self-regulation? It's a good question. Do they do a good job of controlling the news that gets out? Here's another picture they talk about in the book. Just the power of TWA Flight 847, 1985 hijacking. Back in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a lot of hijackings. That was kind of the method of operation. This is pre-Al-Qaeda. A lot of times it was Palestinians. There's actually a section in the book where they talk about, I think her name is, I might even have a picture of her in a later slide. I can't remember. But anyway, the Palestinians were heavily involved. And again, you can see this broadcasted throughout the world, and shows the fear, but at the same time shows the daring in their mind. We are freedom fighters. It shows that we'll stop at nothing to get victory, to accomplish our goals. Again, the media is a weapon. Information is power. And obviously, the contagion effect is something that has to be concerned with. Governments that are fighting terrorism have to be concerned with. I think it's also, I wanted to point out, of course, these are other images of how the media has been used. There's different outlets throughout the world for media, especially in the Middle East. And some of these are worth looking at. They usually have English channels as well. And then, of course, you have your hostage situations on the bottom right that really dominate the media when they're occurring. Currently, the Islamic State seems to be dominating. They just executed some Japanese prisoners that they had captured, innocent civilians that were news people. Another thing I want you to look at is when you talk about self-regulation in the American media, it's always been a very controversial topic. It's something to look at. And it's called gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is a process of self-regulation by the media. You'll have to make your own decisions on whether or not you think they do a good job of gatekeeping their own. And it's pretty interesting when you read that particular box on page 78, how they talk about President Roosevelt, of course, who was in a wheelchair. The press never showed pictures of him in the wheelchair, because they would, at the time, people with disabilities were not considered to be, did not have the same respect in the culture that they have today. So they didn't want to I'm assuming they didn't want to show him in the wheelchair to make him look like he was weak. And he was a very sick man at times. But again, his declining health was never reported extensively to the public. And so the public basically restrained, public being the public media restrained from reporting his illness and his sickness out of respect for him and also the office. John F. Kennedy was always portrayed as a man of great vigor and youth, and yet he suffered from extreme back issues, severe allergies, spinal problems, and he had actually had bouts with malaria that he'd picked up during the Second World War. And then contrast that to Bill Clinton during his time period, where he was involved in extramarital rumors of extramarital affairs. The Monica Lewinsky episode, that stuff was covered, and the news media really didn't. They reported it just the way they thought it, and the coverage was gatekeeping practices, as they talk in our textbook, were virtually non-existent. In other words, he was fair game as far as they were concerned. He was not treated the same as Roosevelt and Kennedy. And I think if you look at President George Bush and look at Barack Obama, they probably don't get, they've been under the microscope, so to speak, as well. And of course, the advent of this 24/7 news station, news coverage, I think, has a lot to do with it. And that'll end this dictation.